joined by our guy, Chris Biderman, Candlestick Chronicles, Sacramento B. Chris, how you doing, man?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you guys?
We're good. We're good. Chris, look, the most important question here today is, what is the cutoff age for trick-or-treating?
Oh, man. 12, 11. Like if you're in high school, like, because this happened to me last year. It was like, you see a bunch of cute little kids and that's all fine. And then you see a bunch of kids who like stole a hat from their parents or something and just walking around to get free candy. It's like, come on, man.
All right.
I agree. I very much agree.
I said 15 sophomore year, but I hear you. If you're dedicated, I think that matters too, but I hear you. All right, Chris, trade deadline, 1 p.m. We've heard a ridiculous amount of names from Devontae Adams to Derrick Henry. Are the Niners going to do anything, or are they going to stand pat?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they're going to be active for sure. This is a team that's been extremely active at the trade deadline since John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan have taken over. Jalen Johnson, the cornerback from the Chicago Bears, would seem to make a lot of sense, and he was somebody that they seemed to be interested before the draft when he came out a few years ago. Maybe an edge rusher. I just don't know. Look, like, we came into the season believing this team was one of the most talented in the league and had one of the most complete rosters in football. They added Randy Gregory. He hasn't made a huge difference. Actually, they're winless since adding him, oddly enough. That's not a Randy Gregory stat. It's just sort of a weird point. But I like, Jalen Johnson would make sense, but to me, I think this roster is good enough. I think the improvement has to come internally and just the team has to play better. Because I think they absolutely have the talent, and it's going to be tough for them to add contracts because, as I told you guys last week, like the salary cap stuff, they need to roll over all the cap space that they have this year into next year just to afford all of their guys that they have under contract next year. And if they do bring in an expensive player who does need a new contract, then you're looking at potentially losing guys, and maybe, somebody like Eric Armstead or one of your other high-priced veterans has to move if you do add another big contract at the deadline. So, I think I could definitely see them being aggressive because they have before. But if they're not super aggressive, I think they could still fall back on the fact that they do have a talented roster and that the fix is more likely just playing better and playing up to their expectation and their level that they set for themselves rather than relying on somebody to give them a boost.
Chris, I'm just curious in general, like, and it's not just a football conversation. We talk about it with the Kings as well. In sports, you can either kind of make a decision when you're adding people to either lean in more so into your strengths. So like the Kings can get more shooting, or you can try and address some of the things you're bad at, i.e., rim protection or whatever it may be. In the 49ers case, it might be DBs. Where do you fall kind of in that philosophy of should the Niners, more focused on the Niners sense, should they be looking at trying to, bolster D-line where it already feels like they're great, bolster the receiving room? Derrick Henry talks as well. Like, do you think that you should focus more on what you're good at and lean into it, or should you try and, patch up some of the bigger holes in your lineup?
Yeah, I think keeping your strength is probably the smartest way to go, because the 49ers are designed, like when we talk about defensive line, right? Like, they've doubled down on their defensive line over and over again in terms of adding talent there, because if there's any attrition, you still want your defensive line to be your strength because they're built front to back defensively, and everything they do defensively is predicated on pressuring the quarterback. And so if you were to, maybe even out your resources in terms of how you allocate them, then, if you do deal with an injury or two along your defensive line, well, that strength is no longer a strength. And then you have to change the way you play. So for the 49ers, in my opinion, I think they, if they can get a pass rusher, somebody who can come in and make a difference at a reasonable price, I would absolutely consider it. But again, like, that's a very premium position, and they did already add Randy Gregory. And frankly, their defensive line should be good enough to where they don't have to add somebody else at this point. But in terms of philosophically, like, I tend to, like, if you've defined some clear strengths on your team, no matter what the sport is, making sure that strength is always your strength as the season goes along. If you deal with injuries or whatever can happen, I think that's really important. And then you could find ways to sort of patch together improvements in other areas. Like, I think the 49ers could potentially maybe they get a Dory Jackson or Jalen Johnson or somebody like that. And it's not super cost prohibitive. I think Johnson probably would cost a decent amount, but you can do that and patch together a way to solve your weaknesses rather than taking away from your strength in that sense.
Talking to Chris Biderman, Candlestick Chronicles, and the Sacramento Bee. Chris, Steve Wilkes has been under a lot of fire lately, right? And from not being in the booth to the amount of blitzes, how much blame do you think he should be getting when you have somebody like Fred Warner saying, hey, we got to tackle these guys? It's not all on Coach Wilkes, but how much would you say the defensive struggles have been on Coach Wilkes?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think you could make a case, I think particularly Sunday against the Bengals, that it just didn't feel like there was the same level of intensity that the defense typically has, right? Like one thing that Robert Saleh and D'Amico Ryans did, they both did this, was, during film sessions during the week, they would track loafs, what they called as loafs. And they would basically call players out and hold them accountable in the meeting room. And it was, basically unacceptable. Like the worst thing you could do as a defender on the team was have any sort of loafs. In the film room, and it just feels like there isn't that same level of intensity right now with the defense. And I don't know if that speaks to the level of buy-in that they have from Steve Wilkes. I don't know if it speaks to there not being that level of accountability that the previous defensive coordinators had. But I think that there's just, I don't know, like if you were to tell me that the defense wasn't buying into the scheme and they didn't have a whole lot of confidence in the scheme, I think that sort of showed up on Sunday. At least that's like, you could convince me of that, right? Like I'm not in there, I'm not in the locker room, I'm not in the meeting, so I'm not going to pretend to know like exactly what's happening, but it just doesn't look like the 49ers defense are buying in and playing with that same level of intensity. And, like you can kind of tell, I thought in the press conference last week when Steve Wilkes came out and apologized for the zero blitz call at the end of the second quarter against the Vikings, it was kind of weird, right? Like it was like melodramatic and like a little bit unnecessary. And like, I don't know, like you can like, I think there's similarities in press conference settings and team meetings in that like you're speaking in front of people and you have to exude confidence, right? And people who are listening to you need to believe in what you're saying. And from that standpoint, it was like, man, do the 49ers, like, are they buying into what this guy is selling them? And that was a question I had after the press conference. And then seeing the product on the field on Sunday, it was just like, man, these guys are like missing tackles. Kyle Shanahan said the defense was slow and tired, which is never something we've heard about this defense in the last few years, right? They just always play hard. And so the fact that they're quote unquote slow and tired, according to the head coach, and you do have all these other question marks revolving Steve Wilkes, like my antenna's up. Like to me, it feels like something could be amiss there. And as good as the 49ers have been at hiring, assistant coaches over the years, you wonder if at some point they're going to hire a lemon. And like, I think our radars have to be up at this point, given how much talent they have and given the general lack of production over the last 3 weeks.
Right. Niners heading into the bye this week. They come out of the bye with continuing to have a pretty tough schedule, have Jacksonville, and then have to finally play the Seahawks, and then the Eagles as well, the much anticipated Eagles matchup in week 13. What do you think about those challenges that are ahead for the Niners, and what are you hoping to learn or see, or even what do you hope to see them be challenged on in those upcoming tough matchups?
Yeah, one thing that was interesting about the offseason and the schedule release, I forget the name is eluding me, but someone took a deep dive into schedule rest, right? And the schedule rest disadvantage that teams have. And the 49ers played the Browns, who were coming off a bye. They played the Bengals, who were coming off a bye. And obviously them coming off a bye and the 49ers having a short week is a pretty substantial disadvantage when it comes to rest days leading into that game, right? And I'm not making excuses for the 49ers, but it's interesting that they had those two teams coming off byes, and then when they come off their bye, they're playing the Jaguars, who are coming off their bye. So the 49ers don't even get the advantage on the flip side of their bye week. So it's a challenging thing for them, but look, there are no excuses in the league. Like everybody in the NFL has crazy schedule things happen. The 49ers don't have to go to Europe like some of these teams, right? Like they don't have to, everybody in the NFL has a tough schedule. Everybody plays 17 games. Everybody deals with injuries. So it's really just going to be about resiliency. Like how resilient is this group? And I think in the past few years, you look at their starts, I think they're 3-4 last year, 3-5 the year before. And they've made it to the NFC Championship game in each of those seasons. So this team is resilient, and it's proven that it can bounce back. But a 3-game losing streak to teams that they should have beaten or that they should consider themselves better than is a little bit alarming at this point. So can they bounce back against a good team in Jacksonville on the road, coming off their buys is going to be really telling. And I think these next few weeks, to your point, Chris, is like, how they bounce back and how they play over these next few weeks is going to go a long way towards determining the fate of this team this season, because they came in with Super Bowl expectations and they should be able to bounce back from this adversity because they've done it before.
Chris, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for the info, my guy. We will talk to you next week, and I will have some questions because it's a bye.
Right.
We can ask even more questions because I need to ask your opinion on Nick Bosa. But thank you so much.
Yeah,
that is Chris Biderman. Let's talk soon, man.
Yep, absolutely. If I see any 15-year-olds at trick-or-treating, I'm going to tell them to kick rocks for you. Right?
Thank you.
Man, no, come on, man. Come on. That's Chris Biderman,
man,
Candlestick Chronicles, and the Sacramento
See you guys.
Bee. Got to get to a break. When we get back, we're talking Kings. Stiles and Watkins, Sactown Sports.
Trying to find out where to catch your favorite team's games?
Are you a fan of the Kings, Niners, and the NFL?
Well, Sactown